We have 3 speakers this afternoon that will unpack various aspects in regards to this topic. So what will happen is that each presenter will obviously present on a particular topic. And when everyone has done presenting, we will then have a Q&A session. So we do request that if you feel your question cannot wait until our Q&A session, you just pop it into our chat box and we will read it at the allocated time. Our first speaker is Ms. Takalani Nechibale. Ms. Takalani Nechibale is a South African institution civil engineer, award-winning civil engineer and project manager. She is currently developing and managing infrastructure projects for the KwaZulu-Natal Health Department in Pietermaritzburg. She has a passion for earthworks, concrete works, roads, and stormwater systems. And she also enjoys designing, implementing, and project managing intelligent road systems and transport solutions. She is the deputy chairperson of the SciES Ethics and is a member of the SciES Future Leaders Panel, Diversity and Inclusivity Success through Academic Readiness. She is also an ambassador for women engineers and the Mase Lulegane candidacy program. Ms. Nechibale, the virtual stage is yours.
Good afternoon to everyone. Is everyone able to see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. So what I will be doing today is I will be sharing some of the lessons that I've learned from some of the projects on site. And this is coming from a perspective of someone that's currently working in construction in the government sector. And my topic is just about how to be safe and work with hazardous substances in the industry. In terms of the topics that I'll be covering, I'll just give a brief introduction of who I am, although they have already done so. Second, I will touch on hazardous substances that we use in construction. And then what I will do is I will a substance that we use in our projects in the government, which is asbestos and asbestos removal, as well touching base on how to work with asbestos substances. Okay, as the host has mentioned, currently working in the civil engineering construction space. I have 6 years experience, got full qualifications in civil structural engineering as well as project management. And as she's mentioned, I'm an ambassador for Warm Age, Masidulukani, and I sit on various committees. So just diving straight into the topic, hazardous substances. What are they specifically in construction? Number one, they do cause harm. So, and there's a reason why we need to ensure that we take extra precaution when working with hazardous substances. Number two, substances are also dangerous in transit. We are aware that there are some, there's always an issue when we see gas tankers exploding on the highway. Seeing specific hazardous substances in transit is because we know that while they are moving, they're more dangerous as compared to them being stored in a warehouse. And lastly, if you need to sample your hazardous substances, do it, but only if it's possible. I do have experience in some of the projects that I've worked on where we just wanted to understand what's inside of the box or what's inside of that specific item that they delivered on site, but we were not. So, and therefore, we shouldn't do it unless we have proper training and the health team has approved it. So, just to give you substances, as stated in the Hazardous Substances Act, number one, we've got explosives, then we've got flammables, we've got those substances that are oxidizing, we've got those that are toxic, those that are corrosive, and those that are ecotoxic. I'm sure for those who are attending the session, they have experience either working with some that do some of these that are categorized under these categories, and some work with all of them. I think I've worked with just a handful of them. But just narrowing it down to the hazardous substances that we use in construction, as I identified. The first hazardous substance that we work with is asbestos, as I mentioned, and it's hazardous because it affects your lungs, your eyes, skin, and you need to use specific PPE, as well as getting approval from inspection authorities. Number two, another hazardous substance that we use is silica. And this is because it causes multiple diseases, mainly lung diseases and cancer, and kidney diseases. And the aim is to just make sure that when you're working with silica, which is in the form of bricks, cement, or mortar, that you do wet seeping instead of dry seeping just because of the particles that go up in the air. Number three, we work with spray paints, and it's hazardous because it affects nerves and the brain functions, can lead to cancer and blindness and kidney damage. Apologies for the background noise. Number four, we work with lead because it causes damages to the central nervous system, and you need to make sure that you discard any waste that is contaminated with lead. Make sure that you wash your hands. And number five, we've got carbon monoxide, which is always referred to as the silent killer, because when you're exposed to it, you would have flu-like symptoms, headaches, heavy eyes, and it could lead to you passing out or even death. And you need to work with it in a space that has effective and efficient ventilation. And lastly, mold and dust. We don't look at mold and dust as being that key, but mold is what you find in damp areas, and dust is found working with wood and anything to do with concrete, bricks, and mortar. And they both do cause respiratory problems. So you need to make sure that you wear goggles and wear your dust masks when you. So I've just put up pictures of those that might not have an idea of look for the different types of hazardous construction. Number one, in terms of asbestos, you will most likely see it as your asbestos roof sheetings, but asbestos is also there in your gutters, your rainwater goods at some of these facilities. And then when it comes to silica, as I've mentioned, typically found when you're working with concrete, bricks, and mortar. We also have spray paints, an example of lead, an example of carbon monoxide. The other day when we were in the office, one of our servers blew up and released carbon monoxide. And I tell you, it's actually a silent killer because none of us knew what was happening, but we're not being okay. And only there when the health and safety lady was around, she mentioned that we all had to evacuate the building because of the fact that it's very hazardous. And lastly, that's just a picture of mold and dust, which we typically also find in your house in some of these damp areas. Okay, so how do you handle hazardous substances? I'm no expert, but these are just some key points that I have come across. Number one, make sure that you have correct training. Don't rush to work with anything you don't understand or you're not trained for. Make sure that there's always someone that's part of the health and safety team that can assist you or train you in working on that specific hazardous substance. Number two, you need to make sure that you store your hazardous substances properly. I am aware that when we're working with contractors, sometimes we take shortcuts and we stack whatever substances that we've got just because we don't want to buy proper storage or we can't afford it, or place any, let's say, for example, you put your diesel tanks on the ground without it being funded, and when it spills, it affects the environment. I know we do that on site, but it's quite crucial to make sure that you understand what you need to store and how you need to store it, because as much as it might not seem like it's hazardous because it's sitting still, it definitely does damage and affect not just the environment, but even the employees on site. Number three, if you can limit the use of hazardous substances, there are different alternatives. If you're not sure, speak to your health and safety team. They will provide you additional information on what else can you use instead of using the typical structure. I'm aware we're not building houses anymore with asbestos roof sheeting, but I am aware that there are some people that might be homeless that they just take whatever that they find and they build. But if we can, that is better. And lastly, make sure that as an employer that you also provide your team with additional PPE. So make sure that you read up on the type of substances that you're working with and the exact type of PPE that you need to purchase. Do not compromise on it, because at the end of the day, when your employees are affected by this, by any substances that they're working with, then the first question that they will ask you is, did you provide them PPE? And if you didn't, then you're faced with endless court cases and having to pay very large number of fines to the families. Okay, so just to dive straight into asbestos. So asbestos is a name given to naturally occurring fibrous particles, and I'm sure you might have seen this type of thing either in the rural communities or in townships. For us, my exposure to asbestos with our project is mainly in hospitals. So we have segments or sections of the hospitals that were built ages ago, and they are still made of asbestos in the moment. I mean, the roof ceiling is quite low. The facility is just horrible. And as well, on top of that, it's got asbestos roof sheeting. So just to give you a few facts. Years ago, back then, Stone Ages. And if you were not sure, because of the fact that South Africa isn't producing much asbestos anymore, there are countries that are still producing it on a yearly basis. The country that tops that at the moment is Russia, followed up by Kazakhstan, Brazil, and China. In terms of the stats of the number of people that are exposed to it, we're looking at about 25 million people in the world that are exposed to it in their workplace, because we don't just manufacture shootings with asbestos. They use asbestos for a whole 100 other things in different countries. And lastly, in terms of the stats on the deaths, in 2004, there were roughly about 107,000 deaths that were related to asbestos, and asbestos affecting them and causing lung cancer in their lives. So if you're not sure how bad it is, do take the time to Google some of this information and read up on it. And yeah, just to also give you more information, there are 3 types of asbestos. I've listed them there. And in South Africa, we work with the amosite asbestos, but we also have some traces of chrysotile asbestos. Okay, so except for roof sheetings, where else do you find asbestos? It's found in numerous places. So this diagram will give you an idea of where you can find it, or where other countries have installed asbestos. For example, as I mentioned, roof sheetings. We also have rainwater goods. Some of the facilities we found that asbestos piping in the ground. Some places they use it as storm water for their flooring, their partition walls, and so on and so forth. So I think if you are then to be working in a space and you're not sure what that material it is, the best thing to do is to make sure that you speak to your health and safety team to get an inspection authority person to come and have a look at it, because you don't want to be living with asbestos and it affects you for years without you understanding how to then deal with it. So just to give you some more information on asbestos, as I've mentioned, we use it for sheeting, but other countries also use it as they use it for braids, for walls, and they use it for fireproofing because it's got such a high resistance to heat and corrosion. And that's why it was used back in those days for our houses. And as I mentioned, if you're not sure how to identify it, do get in touch with the health and safety team or apply to get an approved inspection authority person to come and have a look at it and let you know what it is. I am aware that asbestos also looks like fiber cement, and sometimes you might not be sure, but it's always key to make sure that you identify it and categorize it and put it somewhere in writing what type of material you have identified. Just some of the health risks that have to do with asbestos. It's mainly the different forms of cancer, because when the microfibers of asbestos are inhaled, they cause a lot of issues. And how they are inhaled is when your asbestos roof sheetings break, or if they start crumbling down in your house. That's where those fibers are then exposed and they're released into the air, not just for the person living in the house, but also those that are working in and around that specific building. And then in terms of disposal, I'll share more information in the next few slides, but there are also numerous manuals on how to dispose of asbestos. So just once you've identified asbestos, you need to then do a risk assessment. So there's an initial risk assessment, and there's also identifying residual risks. So in terms of initial risks, is to understand what's the likelihood of this specific item being asbestos, or what's the likelihood that it is affecting me, and what type of impact it has. And I'm saying it in this sense because we have some of the facilities where, because of the asbestos either not having broken or the sheets are still intact, they have painted over them to just make sure that it doesn't break and release those fibrous particles into the air. And they're still working in the space. It's not to say that it will sit there for the next 100 years. It does need to be removed. But for the time being, they have put in safety precautions to make sure that it doesn't affect people in the building. Then once you've identified the initial risk, you need to then identify the typical residual risks. And these are the risks that will happen even though you try and deal with the asbestos. So for example, I've listed 7, but I'm just going to talk about manual handling. As much as you want to come with a crane and try and pick up the sheets, the aim is to try and not break the sheets. And for you to do that, you might have to do a lot of manual handling. So as a result, you need to get people that are trained to work with them. You also need to get your approved inspection authorities to have those specific sheets. There's also risks of working at heights, being electrocuted by nearby towers. Many risks that are residual after you do try and eliminate asbestos sheets. So what I've done there is I've just put up a breakdown, of what you need to do in terms of removing asbestos. So the first task is always PPE, getting training, assessing the asbestos on site, and preparing the site. So just typically, if found asbestos in someone's house, you need to make sure you're able to remove those people or evacuate them, and remove all the furniture that could be affected by these dust particles. As I mentioned, some of the roofing is not, some of the sheets are not broken, so it could be that you can easily just remove it. But to minimize that risk, then rather remove the furniture or make sure that it's covered, so that when you're working in an area, other elements and objects in your building is not affected by it. Then once you remove it, or once you're actually in the process of removing it, they recommend that you need to make sure your asbestos sheets are wet. And this is so that once you stack them on site, because you stack them in layers of 2, that if there's any damages or any exposure that it has to the environment, that at least it won't, the process won't happen immediately because it's wet, and the fibrous particles will start spreading around. And once you've stored it, then you need to arrange for collection and removal and delivery. Once it is from site, make sure that you clean your area, make sure it's clean. Make sure that you also understand how many sheets you remove from the building, how many is in the transport vehicle, and how many actually ends up on site. You do find contractors that just decide to dump it on the side of the road, not understanding that it's not just impactful now, but even where it stays, it could affect the environment. It could affect people working around it for years to come. And lastly, make sure that it is signed off and inspected by the approved inspection authorities. And lastly, just from a government perspective, you also always make sure that we've got a management plan. In our case, what we did is we started going around the facilities and understanding how many of the facilities had asbestos, the condition, and prioritizing them in a specific way. Thereafter, making sure that you put in a policy to say, by all means, we need to have phased out asbestos let's say in the next 5 to 10 years, and always make sure that you then review that asbestos management plan every 8 years. I did have to rush through my presentation, but if you do want to know more about asbestos, there is an asbestos policy. I'm just putting it up on the screen where you can find all kinds of information about how to deal with asbestos, especially the type of asbestos, because we find it in different settings in our country and also in other countries as well. And that is it from me. If you have any questions, do jot them down and we will answer the questions after all the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nichibale. I'm not sure if that was 20 minutes. It was really short, or maybe it was just that much informative. But thank you so much for your presentation. We will engage you in our Q&A segment. Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen. All right, I'm back. Okay, cool. Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Mr. Apologies for that. Is Mr. Hilton Garnasine. I hope I'm saying this right. Mr. H joined the Department of Employment and Labor in 2005 as an occupational health and safety inspector. He holds a degree in engineering and has various certificates within the occupational health and safety field. He was positioned in Cape Town, Durban, and in Mpumalanga over the years and has moved up the ranks to deputy director. He is now based at the head office in Pretoria. His core focus is on advocacy, inspection, enforcement, and policy formulation associated with the construction regulations. Mr. Garnasine, the virtual floor is yours.
And you can see my presentation on the screen. Me by Ms. Takalani, very informative. And today I'm going to speak on the hazardous substances in construction regulation. You can view my presentation as a continuation of Ms. Takalani. I'm going to touch on some elements that she touched on and just expand more in terms of the legislative requirement. Now, as you can see on the screen, in construction in South Africa, we have a definition for construction work under the construction regulations. And in terms of construction in South Africa, we deem them to be within a construction life cycle. Now, this life cycle or construction life cycle, it's defined under Section 20 of the CBE Act. Now, CBE is your Council for Built Environment Act. And we define this construction life cycle under the identification of work. So basically what this construction life cycle indicates that at any point in a construction site, you are going to be either within stage 1 or stage 6. Now, what this means that at any given time, if we, the inspectors and the enforcement comes to your site, we're going to determine which stage the site is busy at. Is it stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6? Now, as you can see on the screen, I'm not going to go much detail into the stages, but each stage is defined. And you can actually get this information in detail under the CBE Act and the Section 20. Now, why this is important? Because on the top of my screen, you can see I've got the 6 councils there. The 6 councils fall under the CBE, which is your Council for Built Environment. Now, within the 6 councils, you have professionals registered. For example, if you're an engineer, you'll be registered with EXA. If you're an architect, you'll be registered with SACAP and so forth. And we have SSCPCMP, and they have specific categories of registration as well for the construction sector. Now, why this is important for today's presentation, which is more on hazardous substances, is because when you start construction work, it's very important that at the beginning of the construction work, there's always an EIA, which is your environmental impact assessment done. or a geotechnical report done, which is basically a report to determine the soil and any contaminants in the site before the construction work even starts. Now, you will know that for construction work to take place, it has to start with a client. Now, CR5 on the screen on the top, CR is actually your construction regulations. And you'll know every construction work will start with a client. Now, if you're doing construction work, whether you're a contractor, an engineer, or client and stuff, you need to know basically the aim or what's going to be built, what's the end result of the construction work. As I indicated, the 6 stages. You'll start at stage 1 and you'll end at completion. Now, the duty of the client, this you'll find under Construction Regulation 5, the client have to do a baseline risk assessment. Now, for those of you guys who's familiar with risk assessments, you'll know that a baseline risk assessment is a risk assessment specifically aimed from start to finish. So if you remember the 6 stages, we're looking at basically a risk assessment that covers from stage 1 to stage 6. And as you can see on the screen, the reference, the legal requirement for this baseline risk assessment to be done by the client, it's coming from Construction Regulation 5.1a. And you guys are familiar with the Department of Employment and Labor. We do issue construction work permits for large sites, basically sites that's over 6 million rand. And this is one document that we'll request from the client. Very important document. We want to see basically all the hazards from stage 1 to 6. Now, linked to this document, what we also request from the client before we issue him with the permit will be your health and safety specifications. Now, your health and safety specifications, you also find this in most of the tender documentation as well for government projects. And you'll find details of how this needs to be done under your CIDB, which is your Construction Industry Development Board. There's a lot of guidelines and lots of examples of how health and safety specifications are done. Now, why this is important? Remember, whatever hazards it's identified in your baseline risk assessment, your health and safety specifications need to correlate or need to speak to that. Remember, I indicated stages 1 to 6. Now, as you proceed from stage 1 to 6, if you feel like the presenter before me indicated asbestos, if you identify you're going to be using asbestos, it needs to be in your baseline risk assessment. And Takalani also went into detail about how you deal and how you basically comply with the regulations in terms of asbestos. And she mentioned PPE. Now, this PPE requirement is quite specific, and your PPE requirement specifically for asbestos, it must be noted in your health and safety specifications. So that is one of the most important aspects that a client need to do from the very onset of the project. Before you even starts, you need to identify all the hazards and the risk attached to this project from stages 1 to 6. Now, specifically for today, we're just going to focus on the hazardous substances on a construction site. Now, Takalani did touch on asbestos in quite detail, so I'm not going to pay much attention to asbestos. Now, hazardous substances, other hazardous substances identified on the site is dust, it's lead, cement, asbestos, and spray paints. These are just some of the examples of other hazardous substances that you will find on site. And remember, these hazardous substances, they can exist in very different forms. They can exist in solids, they can exist in a liquid form, in a vapor form, in a gaseous form, and even in a microorganism form. So it's important to note that as well. And how does this affect us or the employee or human being on site? Remember, we can get exposed in various different forms. The exposure route can be through our nose, through skin, or through even something that we eat. So it's important that this needs to be identified on a construction site. Now, when you come to legislation, how does this govern hazardous substances on site? The program director or chairperson indicated in an opening statement this morning about duties of employers. Now, that's where the Occupational Health and Safety Act comes about. Under Section 8 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, there's duties of employers. And it's quite specific, and it details out what must be done in terms of the employer to ensure that it takes into account all the risk and assets attached to the project. Remember, this ties in with the stages 1 to 6 as well. Now, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, there's also duties of employees as well, which I'll touch on later. Now, when we're looking at hazardous substances, we've got the OSHA, the first bullet point on the screen. And then if you're using flammable liquids, remember I indicated this, hazardous substances, they exist in all forms, solid, liquid, gases, and so forth. Now, if you're using flammable liquids, the regulation governing that, you'll find it under your general safety regulations, which is under the OSHA Act. Now, depending on the type of construction work being done, if there's any microorganisms that's going to be present on site, then the regulation there applicable is your hazardous biological agents regulation. If there's any asbestos on site, which Takulani covered quite comprehensively, there the legislation there, exactly all what she mentioned is coming out from your asbestos abatement regulation. Remember, this is the new regulation as well. And then if there's any lead, you'll find that under your lead regulation. And the most important regulation when it comes to hazardous substances, it's going to be your hazardous chemical agent regulation. Now, this will cover your dust, your cement, your paint, your chemicals, and so forth. So your hazardous chemical agent regulation is going to be most likely your source document if you have any hazardous substances on site. Now, South Africa in 2019 has mandated that the globally urbanized system of classification and labeling of chemicals will be implemented in South Africa. This is very important to note. We abbreviate this globally urbanized system as GHS. It's an international system which South Africa adopted in 2019. And then in correlation to that, also in 2019, the South African National Standards, which most of us know as previously SABS or currently as well, or we know it as SANS, they also developed a code. And that code is your 10234/2019. And this code was published on the 17th of December 2019. And this code is very important because it details your globally harmonized system in terms of classification and labeling of chemicals. Now, linked to that is Department of Labor's regulation, which we call your Regulation for Hazardous Chemical Agents. Most of you guys will be aware we had previously hazardous chemical substances. Now, that regulation was replaced in 2021 by the regulation you can see on the screen. I copied and pasted it so you can basically Google it and you'll be able to find this on the internet or even on our Department of Employment and Labor website. This regulation was promulgated in 2021 and it's specifically addressing all hazardous substances in general, not only on a construction site. What's important to note is that your hazardous chemical substances, the regulation that was basically applicable before the new hazardous chemical agent regulation, it was repealed. So currently, when we go on site, we still see a lot of reference to your hazardous chemical substances regulation. Now, please note this regulation, it was repealed and it's no longer available or no longer applicable since March 2021. The new regulation, the hazardous chemical agents, which we abbreviate as HCA, it's quite detailed. It's aligned internationally. As I mentioned, the GHS, Globally Harmonized System, and it goes into detail in terms of classification. Now, what's the definition of hazardous chemical agents? Now, an hazardous chemical agent means a GHS aligned chemical agent as provided for in Annex 1. This definition, you'll find this under your regulation, and you can see it's quite a linked definition. One cannot understand what's a hazardous chemical agent if you do not know what's the GHS, which is number one, and what is Annexure 1, what are they making reference to as Annexure 1? So we also define GHS hazard classification. Now this means the GHS hazard classes and hazard categories assigned to your hazardous chemical agents. So this, again, it links to another definition that one may ask the question, what is an hazardous or what's an hazard category? Now your hazard category is also defined in the regulation. What it means is it says it's a division of criteria within a hazardous class in the GHS. And where these hazard categories compare to your hazard severity within a hazard class, and it should not be taken as a comparison of hazard categories more generally. Again, this again leads to another question one can ask, and that's what is meant by an hazard class. Now, an hazard class is also defined in the regulation. You'll find this there under your definitions. And what it means is it's the nature of a physical, health, or environmental hazard under your GHS. So it's important to understand what we mean when we talk about your hazardous chemical agents. Now, it's more broadly defined. I tried to copy and paste it so it'll be easier to basically make sense of it if you're not on the background of chemical sector. So what the regulation did, the new regulation, it divided it categorized these classes into physical, health, and environmental. Now on the screen, you can see your first column there on the left-hand side. It talks about your physical classification. Now, what is your physical classification in terms of hazardous substances? It can mean your flammable gases, your normal aerosols, your flammable and non-flammable liquids. It also talks about oxidizing gases. It goes into detail which gases. It can be your compressed gases, your liquid gases, and so forth. And as you go through the column on the left-hand side, you'll see that it classifies all your physical hazardous chemical agents. Then on the right-hand side of the screen on the top, it talks about your health hazards. So it identifies that as basically your oral, your dermal, your inhalation, and so forth. What's important to note on the column on the right-hand side on the top, you'll note there they talk about skin corrosion, they talk about skin irritation, serious eye damage, serious eye irritation, and so forth. So those are classified as your health hazards. And in the bottom on the right-hand side, which looks like a third column, those make reference to your environmental hazard classes, which talks about short-term, long-term, and basically any effects in terms of your environmental classification. The scope of the regulation, the hazardous chemical agent regulation, you'll find that under 2. This is basically a copy and paste of the regulation, with what's on your screen. Now, for the purpose of today and for the purpose of time constraints, I just want you to focus in the bottom at the 2.3, basically your last 2 lines. What it says that the provision of these regulations do not apply in the case where the lead regulations or asbestos abatement regulations apply. So please understand that in terms of this regulation, any identification of lead or asbestos, it won't apply specifically to your hazardous chemical agents. Now, why is this so? Because there's specific regulations that address this. As you can see on the screen, I copied and pasted these 2 regulations. So it'll be easy for you guys to find these regulations if you're working with asbestos and lead. Asbestos abatement regulation was promulgated in 2020. This is the latest regulation, and the older regulation is no longer available. Before I start my presentation, I was browsing on the chat box, and I see an individual ask the question, why do we still use asbestos if it's so dangerous, from what Takulani said? Now, the answer to that is we do not use asbestos. South Africa does not allow the import or export of asbestos. Asbestos is basically banned. What we have to do is we have to deal with the existing asbestos. So this is what the regulation aim to do? Remember, there's a lot of existing asbestos. I think Takalani even showed us a picture where a lot of the rural areas, they still have asbestos. So the regulation is aimed for us how to handle these asbestos in a safe manner. And then in the bottom, you'll see that's the lead regulation. The lead regulation it's still quite an old regulation, and it's a 2002 regulation. So if you're dealing on a site that has lead, you make reference to that regulation there, your lead regulation 2001. Now, all this ties up on a construction site. Remember my first screen slide, I indicated the stages 1 to 6. Now, in between those stages, a contractor at some point will have to do a risk assessment. And you'll recall that I said that the client does a baseline risk assessment, which covers stages 1 to 6. Now, the principal contractor or the contractor on site, you need to do basically what we call a task-based risk assessment. A risk assessment that talks about the job in hand, immediate dangers, PPE, and so forth. And when you do this risk assessment, you have to ensure that the employees are trained and the contractors are trained as well. This reference you'll find under your construction regulations 9.1, 9.3, and 9.4. So what does the hazardous chemical agent regulation says? It says that an employer or self-employed person must, after consultation with the relevant health and safety representative or relevant health and safety committee, cause an assessment to be done immediately and thereafter at intervals not exceeding 2 years to determine if any employee may be exposed by the route of intake. Remember, the route of intake I indicated it could be through your nose, your skin, mouth, and so forth. So I want to give another example. I mentioned dust as a source of exposure. Now, dust can be divided into various types of dust. As you can see on the screen, you get cotton dust, you get silica dust, you get rubber process dust, you get flour dust, you get grain dust, you get wood dust. So don't take dust literally as the basically a sandy substance that we breathe in. Dust is actually very serious when you classify it, and dust can have really serious consequences to one's health. Now, on a construction site, a typical type of dust that we'll find is on the second row, you'll see silica dust. And I think Takalani also mentioned something with respect to silica dust. Now, silica dust, remember, you will get that dust where you're cutting, you're drilling, or you're sanding up concrete, or you're cutting, drilling up roof tiles, bricks, blocks, granite, quartz, and so forth. And a lot of these activities is done on the construction site. So this dust that's coming out of these activities, it's a very serious dust if it's inhaled into the system. So when you do your risk assessment and when you're doing your stages 1 to 6, remember I indicated a baseline risk assessment must be done. If you know you're going to be doing cutting, drilling, sanding of concrete, roof tiles, bricks on site, you have to identify silica dust as a hazard. And then you have to obviously follow the regulated requirement in terms to prevent an employee being exposed to silica dust. And then this cuts across other sectors as well, not only your construction sector. As I indicated on the left-hand column, there's different types of dust. There's even wood dust, the last row in the bottom. Wood dust, we also find them in construction site. It depends what the type of construction being done, and if there's any woodwork being done on the construction site. And then there's obviously areas that need to be followed. Now, how do you do an assessment of dust? Now, not all dust have been assigned occupational exposure limits. Occupational exposure limits, we abbreviate them as OELs. And these OELs, you'll find them under your hazardous chemical agents at the last part of the regulation. Now, guys, if you do not have this hazardous chemical agents regulation, it's very important for you to download, or I can email it to the presenter or chairperson of this committee. This hazardous chemical agent regulation, it's a 98-page document. So as you can see, it's quite a comprehensive regulation. And there's tables, there's OELs, which indicate your exposure limits. There's also different types of chemical agents. Then they categorize them and classify them and so forth. So if we come back to dust, how do you do an assessment on dust on a construction site? Remember, dust can be classified into various different forms. So if they do not have an occupational exposure limit, then the active ingredient must be taken into consideration. Now, where dust contains components which have their own assigned occupational exposure limits, all the relevant limits should be complied with. So in essence, what I'm indicating, I'm trying to say is that this dust must be analyzed in terms of the activity being done. And if there's an active ingredient, then you will find your OEL on the tables of your hazardous chemical agent regulation. But Takanani did mention something called an approved inspection authority. This is a very important organization or employer organization that we register at the Department of Employment and Labor. It's abbreviated as AIA, which is obviously your approved inspection authority. Now, your approved inspection authority, they are professional organizations of people who's mandated by the Department of Labor to carry out tests, sampling, and so forth in terms of your hazardous chemical agents. Now, remember I said, if you have dust on site and you do not know what contains or what the dust contains, you have to obtain the services of an approved inspection authority who will come out, do a sample of the dust, and will be able to advise you accordingly. This is your contaminants in the dust, and they'll find basically your recommendations or requirement for you to comply with that specific active ingredient in your dust. So remember I indicated you have to do an assessment. Now, after you do an assessment on your site, depend on the type of exposure or type of contaminant, you need to get the approved inspection authority to carry out this measurement program and of basically all your airborne concentrations. Under your hazardous chemical agent regulation, under 3.1, you'll find that we talk about information, instruction, and training. And we go into detail about how this information, instruction, and training must be done. Now, this ties up to your construction regulation 9, the one I mentioned on your risk assessment. So basically, if an inspector comes on site, what we want to see is that in your baseline risk assessment, you identified that you're going to be using a cutting or drilling concrete, for example. That needs to be tied up with your construction regulation 9, and then that also need to tie up in terms of your hazardous chemical agent regulation. Remember, if it's flammable liquid, then it will be your general safety regulation. If it's asbestos, it will be your asbestos regulation, and so forth. If it's lead, your lead regulation. You need to put that in context as well. So what is your hazardous chemical agent training on site? The training must include basically the chemical substance regulation that's in place that govern all aspects of hazardous chemical agents which used in your workplace. So what A is basically telling us that, for example, the asbestos and the lead regulation, those are regulations that govern aspects of the HCA. So you have to use the regulation that's applicable to what's identified on your site. And then what B is talking about the legislated OELs. Remember, your OEL is your occupational exposure limits, and your tables are on the regulation as well. You need to know what's your exposure limit to that specific substance identified on your construction site. And then also you need to ensure that the duties of exposed persons that are likely exposed, those guys or those employees must be trained accordingly. The most important aspect is your control measures. How do you control this and how do you handle it? Remember, there are some activities that have to be done on site, and it needs to be controlled basically. Now, when it comes to your occupational exposure limit, there's two types mentioned in the hazardous chemical regulations. They talk about your maximum limit, which we abbreviate as ML. So we call that your OEL/ML. And then a restricted limit, which is your OEL/RL. Now, these maximum limits and restricted limits, you'll find them under your tables under the hazardous chemical agents. And Regulation 10 of the regulation, it lays out the requirements for the use of the occupational exposure limits, whether it's your maximum or your restricted, and it basically indicates how you can basically achieve adequate control. So remember, we know that in sites, you have to use certain equipment, you have to do certain activities. So you are going to do an activity that's going to basically be dangerous or hazardous. So there are control measures in place which need to be followed. Under your hazardous chemical agent regulation 10, they say, how can you basically control it? They say by limiting the amount of your hazardous chemical agent used, which may contaminate the working environment. So that's one of your ways to control the substances or the hazardous containment. It says you can also limit the number of employees who will be exposed or may be exposed. You can also limit the period during which an employee will be exposed. You can also consider substituting for another HCA, maybe with a lower OEL. And then the last resort, they also indicate that you can use your hierarchy of controls. You'll recall hierarchy of controls on elimination, substitution, and so forth. And PPE, please guys note, PPE is your last resort. So what your hazardous chemical agent regulation 10 is saying, it specifies there in the regulation that you can introduce engineering control measures rather. So that's very important to note in terms of your hierarchy of control on a site. So what happens if you are using hazardous substances on site, you've done your assessment, you've got an AIA, and you're working within your OEL limits as well. You also have to ensure that your employees go under medical surveillance. Now, when do you send an employee for medical surveillance? It indicates on the regulation that when an employee is exposed to specific hazardous substances listed under Table 4 of Annexure 2. You'll recall I indicated if you do not have this regulation, please, I urge you guys to download this regulation. It's free of charge on the internet, or I can send this regulation to you guys. It's quite a comprehensive regulation. As I'm going to iterate and reiterate, it's 98 pages. There's various tables there as well. So if you look at Table 4, under Annexure 2 on the regulation, if any employee is exposed to these substances, then they have to be under medical surveillance. Then they say an employee should be under medical surveillance if he or she have any adverse effect on the health. Remember, it also cuts right down to skin irritation, skin corrosion, and so forth. And then lastly, it says that an employee will have to be under medical surveillance if the occupational health practitioner recommends. Remember, on the construction site, you have to have a fitness certificate. You have to ensure that you comply with that regulation or that requirement. And if the occupational health practitioner recommends you have to be under medical surveillance, then you'll have to follow the requirements of this regulation. So duties of persons who may be exposed, what they indicate on the regulation that the people who might be exposed, employees who may be exposed, they must obey your release prevention, which is a requirement. You have to have basically a mitigation of how to prevent. They must also be aware of your PPE requirements, your monitoring equipment to measure personal equipment exposure, reporting for health evaluations and biological tests as required by the regulations. They must also obey the cleaning up and disposal of materials containing any hazardous chemical agents. You'll note when it comes to hazardous substances, it's very specific on the disposal methods as well. And then the employees who's exposed, they must also be aware and obey the housekeeping at the workplace, their personal hygiene, and environmental and health practices. This information you'll find on the regulation as well. The regulation also talks about spillage and leakage. Now, what it indicates there that an employer must give written instructions of the procedures to be followed in the event of any spillage, leakage, or any emergency situations to drivers of vehicles transporting these hazardous substances. Now, you'll recall that most construction sites, most of the contractors, they sign a Section 37.2 agreement. Your Section 32 is actually falling under your OSH Act. And it goes on to detail here. It says that the employer and the mandatory, your mandatory is basically your contractor on a construction site, they must agree in writing to the arrangement and procedures between them to ensure compliance by the mandatory. So remember, we as the enforcement as well, we don't want to be caught unaware that if there's an incident on site, the employer is blaming the driver and the driver is blaming the site people on site as well. You have to ensure that you have a Section 37.2 agreement on site. Prohibition, general prohibition, this will find under the regulation as well. You're not allowed to use compressed air or permit the use of compressed air with respect to hazardous substances. You're not allowed to smoke, eat, drink, or keep any food or beverages in a respiratory zone. So, guys, in conclusion, again, I urge you guys to go through this regulation, the hazardous chemical agent regulation. Under Annex 3, it goes into details on the guidelines. It talks about exposure of employees to hazardous substances to your health and out. It can be used for prevention and so forth. So again, very informative, and it's very comprehensive and to indicate how you comply in terms of your hazardous chemical agents. Guys, that's all for me for now. I see Zanila is on screen as well. I think I might have went over my time, and I really apologize for that. But I hope you guys did learn something. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you so much, Mr. H. You did go slightly over your time, but I understand. Trying to minimize all of that information in that document must have been quite a challenge. So we do appreciate your efforts made in that regard. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going straight into our question and answer session. We did have some questions in our chat box, so I'll start there. If there's anyone on the chat or on the line, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll acknowledge you, and then you can ask your question out loud. But our first question, in fact, was briefly answered, but let me just read it out again. Our anonymous attendee said, if asbestos is so harmful, why do we keep using it as a building material and rather the global alternatives available? Perhaps just to reword it, because we did hear from Mr. H that, in fact, asbestos is banned in South Africa, and that we're dealing with residual asbestos in homes. Maybe just a bite on the global alternatives. What are we using now in the construction industry in place of asbestos? I think both Dakalani and Mr. H can take a bite at that. You can rather focus on inside the house or outside, but I think let us speak to now the alternatives that we are now using in the construction industry.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think I'll just indicate a perspective with working with hospitals and clinics that are built with asbestos. What we've been doing is in most of the facilities where we've removed asbestos roof sheetings and asbestos rainwater goods, we've replaced that with your IVR roof sheeting. And this is mainly because I work in KwaZulu-Natal, there are some heavy rains and hail. So when we have to install your cement roof tiles, they do break quite often as compared to us installing IVR roof sheeting. So I think that's just one answer from my side. I'm not sure if Hilton would like to add to that.
Mr. H, free to come through.
No, I think Ms. Takalini did cover me as well there. Thank you.
Oh, okay. No, thank you so much. All right. So our next question says, how many AIA are there in each province, specifically Gauteng, and does DL monitor the number of inspections done on sites in each province, and where can we find this information? I think this is a question directed to you, Mr. H.
Thank you, Chair. There's quite a lot of AIAs. There's a list every quarter. It's on our website, on the Department of Employment and Labor website. They're not per province. Some of them are national. They've got branches in all provinces as well. And if you cannot find this list of AIAs, I can send it to the chairperson of this webinar, and she or he can send it to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. H. Please do send that. I do not see any raised hands. Do we have any questions, ladies and gentlemen? All right. So Ms. Mapula Maube says, Chair, if asbestos is this dangerous, are communities where asbestos roofs have to be removed, capacitated, that have to be removed, capacitated about the do's and don'ts? Yeah. I don't know if I did that correctly. I think, let me perhaps reword it for both of you. Chair, if asbestos is this dangerous, are communities where asbestos roofs having to be removed, capacitated about the do's and don'ts related to this?
Okay, thank you. I think just from my perspective, as someone that whose grandmother lived in a house that had asbestos sheeting, the answer to that is that they are aware that it is causing long-term damages, but they are also not capacitated enough all the time in terms of what to do. But what I have seen in some of the communities is they do come and paint over it. So they do have information on how you can live in a house that still has asbestos roof ceilings, but preventing it from breaking and being brittle and removing the fibrous particles by painting it with a specific paint and making sure that if you do remove it, you dispose it. So they are aware of the information, and I think it's crucial for us to also drive the notion of informing the people that are living in communities about asbestos and how dangerous it is. But from my perspective as well, in the hospitals, they are aware of the program that we are ready to remove asbestos roof sheeting. It's the first thing they tell us about every time we come for inspections, and we're definitely prioritizing that. I think from my side, just from my experience, Hilton, I don't know from your side in terms of stats, if you know they're capacitated about it.
Thanks.
Okay, let me just add here, there's no capacitation about that as well. But as Takalani indicated, when asbestos is sealed and is basically treated or taken care of, there's no danger or threat. The danger or threat comes about the moment that it's broken into or it's drilled or and that part. That's when it becomes a danger to persons and the community. Like for example, there was a notice out that we sent recently from the Department of Environment and Labor. No one's allowed to drill solar panels on asbestos sheeting. That's when it becomes dangerous. So as long as it's treated, it's painted, and it's cure-bound, it's not a threat to any person and so forth. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. H. I don't see any questions, but may I please ask just one question? In Ms. Takalani's presentation, she spoke a lot about how a lot of these substances are dangerous in transit, right? And I think we know this based on the gas tank explosion in Boksburg in December. So that's a true depiction of in transit. But recently we've seen the Breeze Street explosion. And what I want to understand around that is who then becomes responsible first for such a situation? And secondly, what was not followed? Or what could have been the potential underlying issues that would then see something like this happen? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Chair. So I'm just going to give an answer briefly because I haven't been able to get the full story of what happened on Breeze Street, but there are a number of contributing factors. I'm aware maintenance is one of the factors. So maintenance and understanding the type of services that are in a specific road section or in a specific communication, that is quite crucial. So you do have a change of management, a change of power, and sometimes there's some information that's not handed over properly, and there's either a lack of information on the frequency of maintenance or understanding the type of services that are around. That's number one. And in that case, I mean, there are different authorities for different types of services. So in terms of whether it was a gas explosion or a collapsed sewer that released methane gas, there's a lot of information that I've heard about it. I'm not sure if Hilton might have more information on it, but I am aware that everyone should take part in managing what these services do. So I did hear there was a comment from the gas provider saying that on their side, their gas is still running. Nothing has collapsed in their regard. They've done their due diligence. Now they have to check the other services. But yeah, I'll hand over to Hilton to just add to that as well.
Thank you, Takalani. Thank you, Chairperson. Remember, there's no resolution or no finding as yet on the Bree Street incident, but you have to be aware of the technicality as well. Remember, we have what we call the MHI regulation, which is your major hazardous installation regulation. And that major hazardous installation regulation, just for reference purposes, there's a new one out, 2022. So again, if you do not have that one, I'll send it to you guys. The old major hazardous regulations is no longer applicable. Now, they talk about basically your exposure and basically what can happen should there be an incident. So again, we cannot rule out, we cannot blame anyone currently for the Bree Street incident. But in terms of your major hazardous installation regulation, before we classify your site as a MHI, we basically ask for a schematic, or we basically ask for what we call a danger zone simulation. So what we want to see, it's on the regulation as well, and this is done by your approved inspection authority. We want to see a simulation of should something go wrong, how it will affect the community, how it will affect any person that may not be directly affected to this hazards and dangers. So remember the Bree Street incident, we're not 100% sure if there's any other criminal activities associated there as well. So in terms of any pipeline, any gas and stuff, it is regulated under your MHI regulation. And before we classify that, there's a full procedure that needs to be done there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Takalani. Thank you so much, Mr. H. We truly appreciate your presentation, and we appreciate you engaging us in our Q&A segment. I don't see any questions, and I think that would mean we can continue. Thank you so much, but please do stick around and hear from our next speaker. Our next speaker is obviously not new to this platform. In fact, our previous safety webinar we held with him. Dr. Manu, I hope you're on standby. For those who may not be familiar with you, I'm going to read your bio still. Welcome. All right. Lighting his presentation there, and I'm just opening up your profile. Dr. Sanjay Manu has over 20 years experience in the risk and financial services industry. He started his career at Alexandra Forbes and is now the Chief Business Development Officer at FEM. He has held several leadership positions, including that of Chairman of the Board from 2012 to 2014 at the Workers' Accident and Rehabilitation Center. He is the Chairman of the KZN MBA Health and Safety Committee from 2013 to 2016. Dr. Manu has a PhD in Construction Management, an MBA, Diploma in Mechanical Engineering, and BCom. Sanjay is a fellow chartered member, CM SIOSH, and President of SIOSH. Welcome, Dr. Manu. The virtual stage is yours.
Thank you, Zantile. And good afternoon, everyone, and certainly very informative webinar that's taking place today. I think what we also realize is that, we normally focus on struck by incidents or falling onto different levels. But I think, hazardous substances, I think definitely has a place in terms of the dangers that exist on the construction site. So a little bit about FEM. So we provide workmen's compensation to the construction industry in terms of the COID Act. We've been in existence since 1936. And certainly we pride ourselves in terms of caring about the quality of life for injured workers and their dependents. And we champion health and safety for the benefit of the construction industry and for society. Just a general update in terms of Schedule 4 benefit changes that were introduced in 2019. So for permanent disabilities, where the severity doesn't really matter whether it's 1% or 2% or 5%, there's a minimum compensation, a minimum lump sum that we will be paying out, which is about 100,000 Rand per year or per incident. And I think that's going to be quite costly going forward. So definitely an appeal to health and safety practitioners and to the SMMEs to try and prevent any serious accidents on construction sites. We've then launched a health and safety mentorship program established for 10 SMME policyholders per health and safety grant recipient at FEM. So that's been rolled out this year. And if you are aware of any SMMEs, to please do send those details through to us, and we will be in contact with them and perhaps be able to put them onto this program. We will be hosting our September conference in Johannesburg. That'll take place on the 20th of September, in Cape Town on the 22nd of September, and then in Durban on the 29th of September. We are then also rolling out a new online policyholder platform where the annual return of earnings can be submitted, and in fact claims as well. So what we would try to do is implement a very efficient system so that accidents can be reported in live, and also documents as well can be directly loaded onto this particular system. To bring to your attention that the 5-year assessment model that's been implemented by the compensation fund. So we're noting that, for example, the main categories, which will be building and electrical construction, we will see the rates increase in 2024, which is currently in this year it's 22.39%, but in 2024 it will then increase to 2.52%. And for civil construction, which is the next largest category of employees at FEM, that will increase from 2.36 to 2.50 in 2024. So the premium or the assessments will be increasing for those particular categories, whereas in Class K, for example, concrete works, the tariff rates will be decreasing from 2.39. For steel construction and erection of steel structures, it will be decreasing from 3.04 in 2023 to 2.87 in 2024. We've launched the premium audits this year, so we have been engaging with a number of employers and auditing the return of earnings, and we have been picking up cases where they've under declaration on the return of earnings. So please to encourage employers to declare the true earnings on the return, on the ROEs, right? So that process is ongoing, and it's also not just an FEM process, but a process that's been implemented by the Compensation Fund and Rand Mutual as well. The COID Amendment Bill that's been enacted, it was assented into law on the 17th of April this year. We are still reviewing it between the Compensation Fund, Rand Mutual and FEM, but notably the major changes will be if the accident is attributable to the serious and willful misconduct of the employee, compensation will still be payable to that employee. In terms of the Act, recoveries from the Road Accident Fund will no longer occur, penalties for non-compliance with COIDA, and focus on rehabilitation and return to work of injured workers. Okay, so going through the statistics that, noting that we cover just over 300,000 employees in the construction industry and just over 6,000 employers. So this statistics is definitely very alarming. When we look at the fact that 47 employees have been killed in 2022, right? So when you look at statistics, of course, it paints a very poor reflection in terms of the health and safety compliance levels within the construction industry. Noting that though in 2022, the majority of fatalities were as a result of motor vehicle accidents, where we saw that there were 21 fatalities. And then on a very recurrent basis, where we find that struck-by incidents are definitely the leading cause of the number of accidents, where we see that 32.38% of all accidents were as a result of struck-by incidents. So from a FEM perspective, we do have a struck-by subcommittee that's been established and chaired by different, it actually comprises of different individuals from leading industry bodies. And certainly what we will be looking at is common trends, case studies, and also looking at it according to different scopes of work, for example, civils, building, and plumbing, right? So we will be disseminating more information in terms of that. So this then provides an overview in terms of the FEM's claims experience as of June 2023. So from January up until June 2023, and noting, which is quite concerning, that 27 people have been, killed this year. There've been 27 fatalities, and majority of those as a result of motor vehicle accidents. And then also noting a very similar trend where there've been 34.3% of all incidents or all accidents as a result of struck by. Of concern is when we look at the prior year, 2022, again, you would note that there are 561 permanent disabilities, which is definitely a high concern when we're noting that majority of the individuals within construction are unskilled, and for an individual who's been permanently disabled to seek alternate employment or employment within construction would be fairly challenging, right? So hence we then have launched the rehabilitation and reintegration program as well. So comparing the same period, so this is as of June 2023, and comparing it to the same period as of June 2022, so meaning from January up until June 2022, there were 21 fatalities for that period, and as a result of majority being caused by motor vehicle accidents, and then in second place struck by incidents. But also noting again, you can see very similar trend of 33.8%. When we talk about lagging indicators versus leading indicators, certainly a more focused, initiatives need to be on this particular cause of accidents, which is struck by. So when we talk about claims per agency for 2022, you can see that for acids, or this is not elsewhere classified, there were 10 accidents that occurred. Asbestos, there were 3 accidents. Benzols and its compounds, there was just 1 accident in terms of this, but certainly maybe there's a lot more incidents for the rest of the industry, noting that, as I mentioned, we cover just 300,000 employees in the construction industry, and so noting that this is not a true reflection for all employees in construction. When we talk about injuries, 1,000 lives in the construction industry, so the blue bar indicates the injuries, and the red is the indication of the diseases. So you can see, of course, a much there's definitely a disparity in terms of the number of injuries compared to the number of diseases. But noting that when we talk about, for example, 2020 to 2021, we do know that COVID-19, hence the increase, we did see that there was a increase of 2.42% and 2.77 for every 1,000 lives, right? When we talk about the claims distribution per subclass, so noting that building contractors, this presentation will be shared with all, so you can go through this in detail. So noting that when we talk about building contractors, if you look at civil engineering as well, where there's a higher number of accidents within the Gauteng area compared to the rest of the country, right? So that's predominantly where we find the majority of our policyholders or employers are. So hence the higher number in terms of accidents within the Gauteng area, right? So looking at the total number here for all of the subclasses. When we talk about the top 10 injuries for 2022 versus 2023, so you would note that, for example, superficial wounds, with its majority of the claims, and also noting for 2023. So on the left-hand side, we have the top 10 injuries for 2022, and then on the right-hand side, where it indicates the top 10 injuries for 2023. But a very similar trend when looking at the high number of incidents. But noting that when we talk about penetrating wounds, so muscle injury, bone injury, this is for injuries. And then we got dermatitis as well when we talk about the top 10 diseases as of July 2023, that particular year. And we could see that dermatitis, which is exposure to dust, liquids, and other external agents or factors, where there were 70 claims that had been submitted through to FEM, right? Just going to move this here. For the 2023 year, we had 44 since January up until July. So definitely a major concern in terms of dermatitis being the number one cause of diseases, right? When we talk then about erosion, and this is what was quite concerning when you talk about oral and nasal cavity irritants, alkalis, acids, or fumes thereof. So inhalation would definitely be a cause, where we see that there were 15 claims in 2022, right? Okay. So noting that last year there was quite a terrible incident that was reported in the media, and there were 3 construction workers who died in a drain accident where there was inhalation of methane gas. So certainly those 3 fatalities were covered by FEM, but also to be, to just provide a word of caution that when entering confined spaces, to make sure that, you may be testing as well in advance. You have the proper PPE. I think Hilton did point out in terms of the hierarchy of controls, where elimination is certainly the highest in terms of that, and perhaps substitution, which would be another aspect. When you talk about some of the chemicals that are commonly used in construction, for example, cement, and you note that there'll be a lot of people inhaling the dust, and we're not sure in terms of what the long-term impact of those cases are, right? So when you talk about benzene, we talked about We had, in terms of our case or the agency, we talk about paraffin as well, benzenes, which cause cancer. So a lot of dangerous chemicals or hazardous chemicals on the construction side that employees need to be cautious of. I think also when you talk about perhaps labeling items as well, right? So that will be a key component in terms of maybe an employee who's inexperienced in construction will be quite cautious in terms of touching any of those items. So yeah, these are the two claims we had this year. So it was actually two employees. Well, one incident where the employee was doing a rough runs and the chlorine fumes started affecting him. Another employee was scrubbing the midnight machine. The employee smelled the fumes of chlorine. But looking at some of the claims costs, so the one was about 65,000, and the one was in excess of that. But you may think it's a simple aspect in terms of these chemicals, but it can be quite costly and quite it can cause quite serious damage to an individual or an employee. So just in terms of a recommendation to be quite cautious, especially when it comes to chlorine. I'm going to conclude my presentation and just to say thank you to the BBCBE for this invite, and wishing you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manu. Thanks to you too for continuously being available to us and sharing all your knowledgeable nuggets. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I do not see any questions in our Q&A chat box, so I'm going to open it up and request that any of our attendees pop us a question either in the chat box or also feel free to raise your hand. We will acknowledge you and allow you to speak. Should there be any questions related to our quota and stats shared by Dr. Manu? Oh, no questions at all. All right. No, that's fine. This was an information sharing webinar anyways, so it comes in the form of education. Maybe everyone is still digesting some of all of this information, so we will not pressure anyone to actually ask a question. In fact, we will be sharing all of these presentations with you as our attendees, so do keep a lookout for that. But do feel free to actually catch the recording of the session on our YouTube channel, which is BBCBE TV. And that will be available on YouTube. It's actually available already. So if you feel like there's something you missed, please feel free to just go back and check it out. I'm going to hand over to Nkuli. My task ends here. Thank you so much for being such a well-mannered crowd. Thank you so much to our panelists. And let me hand over to Nkuli. Let me not do the vote of thanks on your behalf. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? As a very, very well presented presentation regarding health and safety substances. I also like to acknowledge Takalani and thank you for sharing your experiences and the importance of how to be safe from hazardous substances, and especially when you speak about the asbestos, silica, and carbon monoxide. Sorry about that. That was very, very informative, and how these substances do harm to our bodies and organs. And then I'd also like to send my acknowledgement to Hilton as well for actually explaining the importance of understanding tender documents regarding the regulations and importance of health and safety, and how two parties should actually sign. Also important how two parties should actually sign the importance of the health and safety compliance agreements before doing any project. And then last but not least, I'd also like to thank Dr. Manu for speaking about the FEM workmanship and how it is important for contractors to join FEM as well, and also actually sending out a notice on the Safe Timber conference that will be happening soon in September this year. and also sharing through the Corridor Act and statistics on health and safety. I would also like to, sorry about that. Would also like to thank all our attendees making the time and attendees of this webinar. The aim is to make our webinar, especially in the emerging construction sector, of how to handle hazardous substances on their sites and their workplaces. Would like to also thank BBCBE leadership and BBCBE members and marketing team and the marketing team who are in this attendance as well. We also recently actually experienced and heard about the gas explosions within the country. And we also glad that one of our participants actually asked a very important question on that, and that was actually well answered. Would also like to thank the FEM, our partner in health and safety, for attending the webinar, especially Dr. Sanjay Manu, for taking the time to actually share the important statistics and the corridor on the accidents that actually happened on site. Would also like to let our members know that there is an opportunity, and we are having our occupational health and safety we're all having our occupational safety trainings, and that will be open for everyone who will be interested. We have 15 types of trainings ranging from firefighting, knowledge of the Occupational Health and Safety Act and scaffolding, and the list goes on. We are also conducting our site assessments for our members, which are complimentary, and the site assessments will actually help with project compliance and reducing the level of potential injuries on site. We will open this opportunity to all interested attendees. We will put in the chat box our email addresses for more information, and our office number for more information to attend these. And we believe that every construction site and every project within the construction site should be compliant and adhere to the occupational health and safety rules and regulations. Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming, and enjoy.
Nguli, you didn't thank the host. I'm worried I didn't do a good job.
Sorry, and thank you so much, Zandi, for taking your time. Apologies on that one, Zandi. You did exceptionally well. Thank you so much.